Hello and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor Daniel Estrada, and this is the lecture video for Lesson 8. Let's jump into the lesson. This lesson we're studying the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This is a brand new case study that we're going to be doing this week. I've compiled a bunch of sources for you to go through, including a few documentaries from the BBC and a few articles for you to read. There's a lot of interesting things going on in the Deepwater Horizon case, and hopefully going through these sources will give you a rather full perspective on different aspects of the case. I also have these additional sources down here. The main focus of this week will be on the Deepwater Horizon spill, but the sort of secondary motivation for the lesson this week is because you will have a research project due in a few weeks where you have to do an independent research case study of a real historical case. So you're going to need to do library research to do this. The lesson plan for this week, your research project is due in Lesson 10. We're in Lesson 8 now. The research project for this week is really designed to put together the kinds of materials you need to do an effective case study. So your assignment for your own research project is to have 4 primary sources. So I give you 4 sources of the sort that would supply a full research project for your own case study. So this is supposed to be a sort of sample case study for you to do your own. All right, let's start talking about the case. Before we get into the Deepwater Horizon spill itself, I want to talk about maybe some other major oil spills, just to give you some context for assessing how big the damage was. The largest oil spill by far in history was the Lakeview Gusher. This happened in California around the turn of the 1900s, in 1910 and 1911. They were drilling for natural gas. They ended up finding crude oil, and the oil spilled, and they were not able to contain it. The oil continued to spill for 18 months over the years 1910 to 1911. Over that time, we estimate about 9 million barrels was leaked. A lot of that just evaporated. Some of it was recovered, but most of it was evaporated into the atmosphere. It was a major oil spill, by far the biggest oil spill that we're aware of. In modern times, we've had a few big oil spills. I remember Exxon Valdez when I was a kid in 1989. An oil tanker, the Exxon Valdez, you can see the oil tanker there, crashed offshore of Alaska in the Pacific Ocean, leaked its entire tank, which was around 260,000 barrels, sorry. And that all leaked over the span of a couple of days into the Alaska, the Sound there. I remember that was one of the major oil spills in the last few decades. 260,000 barrels. It's fairly small compared to 9 million barrels. Slightly larger was the Ixtoc-1 oil spill. This happened in the Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill also happened in the Gulf of Mexico, but the Ixtoc event happened about 20 years earlier in the Gulf of Mexico. This was a Mexican company doing this drilling that ended in disaster, and around 3 million barrels of oil was spilled over a period of about 10 months when that oil spill happened. So the Deepwater Horizon oil event was bigger than Ixtoc. It was around 5 million barrels, so less than Lakeview Gusher by a significant margin, but more significant than Ixtoc. The Gulf of Mexico has been hit several times with very large oil spills. But there's one other major oil spill around the same size as Deepwater Horizon. These are the Kuwait oil fires. Happened around 1991 for a period of about 11 months from January to November. It was estimated that between 4 and 6 million barrels of oil were spilled, so around the same amount as Deepwater Horizon, maybe possibly slightly more, depending on who you're getting your estimates from. And this wasn't an accident. A lot of the major disasters that we look at in class, we find out aren't really accidents in the sense that they were unpreventable, but in fact you could have prevented them if people had been taking the proper safety precautions. But it's very rare in the cases that we're considering that people are deliberately trying to cause some ethical violation, except maybe the cases of corruption from Spiro Agnew and so on. Most of the cases are people not being properly safe or ethical but still not meaning to do deliberate harm to anyone. The Kuwait oil fires are a little bit different from this. So this happened after the first Iraq War. If you remember the first Iraq War, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Kuwait is a little oil exporting country on in the coast of the Persian Gulf. Very small country. Iraq's a very big country, so Iraq decided that it wanted to take over Kuwait and its oil exporting business. So it takes over Kuwait. The United States and its allies didn't like that, and so the United States goes in and pushes Iraq out of Kuwait. We didn't go invade Kuwait. We didn't go invade Iraq. We just pushed Iraq out of Kuwait. It was a very successful war. It happened over a very short period of time, and we declared victory. And then we just sort of got out of there. But as the Iraqis were leaving, as they were retreating out of Kuwait, they knew that we just wanted the oil there. So out of spite and maliciousness, they opened their oil wells, let them just spill out into the atmosphere, causing huge lakes of oil, and they'd set them on fire. There you see some engineers setting that oil well on fire, and they just let these large oil fields burn for months and months and months. Right? This is much worse than an oil spill, where maybe it gets seeped back into the ground, maybe into the groundwater. Maybe a lot of it gets evaporated, but this gets burned immediately. This is, as you might imagine, it's awful for the environment. And there's also not a whole lot you can do about it. I mean, what do you do about a big burning lake of oil? The wells were eventually contained, some by running out, a lot by they had to invent this device, put on a modified tank. They strapped jet engines to the tank. They were able to blow air and anti-flammable material fast enough into these wellheads that they were able to extinguish the fire, to smother it, basically. And that eventually worked to put out all these fires. But this is a major, major disaster. Around the equivalent amount of oil that was spilled as the Deepwater Horizon case, but in this case, it's also being burned, which is bad. Okay, but let's talk about Deepwater Horizon. So, Deepwater Horizon happens in 2010 off the Gulf of Mexico, basically off the coast of Louisiana. About 5 million barrels of oil are spilled over the course of about 6 months. So there was an explosion on the rig, and the rig goes down in April, and it wasn't until September that they were able to finally declare the well capped. The rig was owned by a company called Transocean, but it was being leased by BP to do drilling in the Mercado prospect, which is a big oil field out here in the Gulf of Mexico. All the oil fields in the Gulf of Mexico have been sold off to different companies, and BP was doing drilling out here. Okay, so what happened? Well, to give a little more context, so this is a deep sea drilling rig. This is one of my supplemental materials, this XKCD, Lakes and Oceans. So this is giving you a sense of how deep we are here, 1,000 meters to 12,000 meters. Up here you see all the different Great Lakes in America. They're all less than 1,000 meters, much significantly less than 1,000 meters. The deepest lake is just under 2,000 meters, Lake Baikal. It's in Russia. Burj Khalifa is the tallest building. It's about that high. It's pretty short. The blue whale is right here. This is about as deep as mammals go. We've seen mammals go down very deep. We don't know exactly why, but most life tends to be up here because that's where the sunlight is. There are some deep, very, very deep sea ecosystems, but most life is up here towards the surface, and most activity is up here towards the surface. Submarines can't go much further below about here. Here's the Titanic on the bottom of the ocean up here. There are big trenches. You might know the Marianas Trench is the deepest part of the ocean, and we've had submersibles go down there. James Cameron, a few years ago, took a submersible down to the bottom of the Marianas Trench. It might be helpful to know the Marianas Trench isn't just a divot like this, but in fact the Marianas Trench is just a low point. It's like a valley, and so this is to scale the Marianas Trench to the surface water. So it's a very low point, but it's not particularly tight or crevice-like. And James Cameron got down there and then came back up, and it was fine. Okay, so Mariana Trench is down here. It's very, very deep. The Deepwater Horizon oil rig is drilling even deeper than that. So here's Deepwater Horizon up here where my mouse pointer is. You can see it on the surface of the ocean in the Gulf of Mexico. About a mile down from the surface of the ocean, or surface of the Gulf of Mexico, is the sea floor, the ocean floor. And that's where the wellhead is, and a thing called the blowout preventer, the BOP. A big device I'll tell you about in a second. So that's about a mile. And then from there, they continue going about 5 more miles, maybe more than that, to the oil reserves, which are somewhere around 12,000 meters below the sea floor. So just from the ocean surface to the sea floor is already a significant distance, too much for humans to go down there, right? So these drilling operations, they don't work by having a human being or a crew of human beings down at the sea floor installing this wellhead. They're doing it all from the rig on the ocean surface. And they're if they need to go down there, they're using robots as spotters and to do manipulations. And that takes time, it takes effort. It's very difficult to work even down here. And then they're drilling several miles deeper, several thousand meters deeper. For reference, the Cora borehole is the deepest we've ever dug, just slightly deeper than the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig. And this was done by Russian scientists just to see what happens when we drill really deep. And they ended up having to stop because their drill bits would melt when they were getting this far. They couldn't get them any further because their drill bits were melting, which is interesting. I know there are currently plans underway to try to penetrate all the way through the mantle all the way through the crust, the Earth's crust into the mantle. So that's going to be a very deep drilling operation. And I know they're going to do it at the ocean floor somehow, but I don't know the details of that. Anyway, this is supposed to just give you some perspective of how extreme of an operation this deep sea drilling is. Keeping a level pipe to do this major drilling, it's very dangerous. It's very expensive. It's not easy. In fact, for most of the history of automobiles, for the use of fossil fuels, it has been prohibitively expensive to access the oil at these depths. It just wasn't cost efficient to try to do all of the very complex engineering to get this oil up out of the ground. But in recent years, as oil is becoming more expensive, as we're running out of oil and it's becoming more expensive, and also we're recognizing its environmental impact and it's becoming more greater taxes, it's becoming less cost effective to use oil. Oil is becoming more expensive, and that means that it's become cost effective to actually dig out this oil. So in 2010, around this time, there was a great expansion in these deep sea drilling operations, and this is what Deepwater Horizon was doing. All right, so here's Deepwater Horizon. There's the BOP, 5,000 feet below the surface, and then the well goes down for another 18,000 feet. If some of you might know from your engineering courses, but in order to build these kinds of pipes, you have a drill, and the drill goes down, and then once the drill goes down a little bit, then you fill up the well behind it with cement to stabilize the sides, and then you can push the drill bit even further. So you're constantly trying to build a little pipe, a little tunnel for you to continue drilling through. And that tunnel has to transport all of the debris that you're drilling through, all the rock that you're drilling through, and any other material, the seawater, any other material needs to go through the drill. And for this to work, for that drill to be going through the rock in a straight line, that drill needs to be very tightly centered in the pipe in order to siphon the oil off. It's a very difficult challenge to keep that pipe centered. Actually, let me go forward one more. So, so to keep the pipe centered, so this is one of the techniques to keep the pipes centered is what are called centralizers. which help keep the pipe from running too close against the edges so that the cement is a stable wall. One of the other big bits of technology is the thing at the surface, at the ocean floor, which is called the blowout preventer. So the blowout preventer is supposed to prevent blowouts, well blowouts, if you hit some pocket of pressure and the oil or some gas or any other thing tries to push out faster than you can take. The blowout preventer is supposed to prevent this. It's supposed to be your emergency lever in case something goes wrong. The blowout preventer is made of several different parts, and it's this huge machine. Here's a person for scale. So it's this huge device. And the device has lots of equipment for connecting up the pipes, but it also has these blowout preventers, including what are called blind rams and a shear ram. The point of these rams is to pinch off the pipe in case anything goes wrong. So if there's a blowout, these shear rams snap closed. It's supposed to pinch off the pipe so that no more oil flows through. And basically what happened is that they hit a pocket of gas or oil, and it ran back up the pipe, and the blowout preventer tried to snap it closed, but it failed, and it failed because it wasn't properly centralized. So you can see in this diagram, the pipe, in order for the rams to effectively pinch off the pipe, it needs to be centered in that ram, but if the pipe is off-center, then when the ram shuts closed, it's going to maybe tear open the pipe or otherwise let oil continue to leak. Right, so the pipe wasn't centered in the well, and so when it was shut off, it didn't effectively shut off, and it continued to leak. The blowout caused a explosion on the rig itself, and they tried to save the rig for a few days, but eventually the rig went under. When the rig went under, it took all the pipe underneath it down to the ocean floor with it, and because the blowout preventer was failing, all of the oil kept spilling out from the well, and it was difficult to contain. So a lot of the resources I have sort of explain the back. So that's sort of technical details about what happened. A lot of the resources I give you explain both the historical background of BP and the technical response, and also the political and regulatory environment that contextualizes exactly what happened during this spill. So the first, and I think the best of the resources I have is this Ingersoll article from 2010, BP and the Deepwater Horizon disaster of 2010. This is the MIT Sloan School of Management article. In this article, they do several things that are interesting. One is that they talk about prior safety violations at BP, prior ethical violations at BP. BP was not a very safely operating company. There were a huge number of violations before this event. In fact, 97% of OSHA violations to oil companies were handed to only 2 BP refineries over the period of 2007 to 2010. And a lot of these have to do with the Texas oil refinery explosion, which happens in 2005. There's a major explosion at a refinery in Texas, ends up killing 15 people, injuring another 180 people, causes $1.5 billion in financial losses. It's a huge explosion, and causes a number of fines and regulatory oversight. This puts a lot of pressure on BP, and instead of making BP sort of clean up its act and change its ways, it actually results in BP making significant cuts to its safety measures over this time period. And we'll see what that looks like in a little bit. But one implication of this is that in 2009, a few years after this explosion, the Deepwater Horizon is not up for inspection, is not up to code. So they have an inspector come look at the Deepwater Horizon. The inspector finds that there are 390 separate issues that require repair. Not just that they require repair, but they require immediate attention. The inspector also evaluates that around 3,500 hours of repair time are needed to bring the rig back up to code. This is in 2009. It was found after the explosion that it had not been in dry dock for repairs in 9 years, and it didn't stop working at any time between the most recent inspection in 2009 and the time that it exploded in 2010. So they were aware of quite a number of significant issues needing immediate attention. But these issues didn't get taken care of, and the Deepwater Horizon ends up exploding in 2010. And as I said, this was mostly the result of the pipe not being properly centralized. And the really interesting thing, I think, from the Ingersoll articles is that they pull up the emails between various important decision makers in the process, including the engineers, the technical evaluators, and the managers, for how this decision got made. So they actually have the emails where the decision was made and the implications that has for what ends up happening. In particular, they have a Gregory Waltz talk about modeling that he had done about how many centralizers would be required for the particular for the particular job that they were doing. And so he says that in order to keep the thing centralized, you need at least you would need at least 15 or 20 centralizers in order to get it into the proper operating range, which is what they need. They had only planned for, so you need about 20 centralizers in order to get this thing properly centralized. They had only planned for 6 centralizers, and the closest centralizers that were available were in Houston. So they would have to have them flown out from Houston, which would delay them by a day or two. It would be very expensive. It would take 10 hours to install them. So the engineer shows the models that suggest that they need 20 centralizers, and the people in the rig say, look, this is not what I was envisioning. That seems like it would take a long time. I'm very concerned about using it. And they decide in these emails that they decide not to use the centralizers. And one of the people says, after they decide that they're going to go ahead and go through with the project without acquiring the additional centralizers, they say, the guy says, look, who cares? It's done. End of story. It'll probably be fine, and we'll get a good cement job. Right, so they know their models show that they need something, and they just don't do what their models say they need, and they go through with it anyway. In this case, it seems to be mostly about the time that it would take, and it's something around $500,000, $500,000 a day to operate the rig. So having a 10-hour delay on their operations is a huge expense, and so they decide that the time delay and the expense it entails is not worth the effort, and they go through with the drilling anyway, and the drilling leads to this blowout. Because it's not properly centralized, the blowout preventer fails, and they have to deal with a leak. So it takes them several months to figure out what to do with the leak. One of the Ingersoll article goes into detail about the decisions made that lead up to the disaster. This first documentary that I have, the BP oil spill, The Untold Story. By untold story, they mean BP's story. And this documentary is really about what BP does after the well starts leaking in order to stop the leak. There's a lot of good information in here. They have a really good animation of what exactly happens to the blowout preventer after the rig goes down. Let me see if I can. Yeah. So the rig goes down, and then about a mile of pipe. About a mile of pipe from the blowout preventer is sort of strewn along the ocean floor, leaking from various places, leaking also from the blowout preventer. And then the rig itself is on the ocean floor also. So there's several different places where this thing is leaking. and they don't really have a way of stopping it, in particular because they can't go down there. So they have robots trying to do things to seal the pipes and close them off as much as possible. But it's very clear that the wellhead is leaking, and they don't really know how to stop that. And the really surprising thing is that they have no plan in place for what to do when the well starts leaking. They have no plan in place for how to stop it. So the first thing they do is they call in this guy. This guy's name's Pat Campbell. Pat Campbell was actually one of the engineers responsible for handling the Ixtoc well explosion, and Pat Campbell also worked on these Iraq oil fires, which were, as you know, very difficult to stop. So Pat Campbell, he's an expert in dealing with these oil fires, especially from the Ixtoc event. So he knows what's going on. But in the Deepwater Horizon situation, even he is at a loss about what to do. They don't know how to stop they don't have a plan in place for stopping the leaking oil head. It's leaking oil too fast, and there's nothing that they know how to do. So their first plan is what they call top hat. So this is the top hat. They go through, here's a guy inside the top hat. The idea was to get this big container and drop the container over the top of the blowout preventer and hopefully contain everything inside this containment unit, and then you can seal up the containment unit. So these containers didn't exist. They didn't have a top hat on hand to drop down there. They had to build it. It took a few weeks to build it, to acquire the parts and to bring it up to spec, especially to make it capable of operating at the deep sea temperatures and pressures it is going to need to operate. So it takes from when the well starts leaking to after they call the experts in and they sort of brainstorm about what to do, to finally figuring out a plan and then implementing the plan. They drop the blowout preventer, they drop the top hat down there. And it's sort of fascinating to watch these people talk about it, because the top hat fails. It fails because as they're dropping it down on top of a leaking wellhead, the oil builds up inside, and at these pressures and temperatures, the oil starts to crystallize and form sort of nitrite or nitrate crystals inside that containment unit. So by the time it gets down to the wellhead, it's so full of crystals that it won't actually fit over the blowout preventer and create an effective seal. So this is several weeks, more than a month after the well starts leaking, where they try to implement their idea and the idea fails. It's sort of desperate at that point. They don't really know what to do. They're shuffling all over the place to try to figure out ideas. At one point, the documentary talks about that someone floats the idea of setting off nuclear bombs on the ocean floor and just hoping that it kicks up enough dust to cover over the wellhead. I think he's the guy that talks about this plan. They don't actually do that, but it was suggested. This is how desperate they were. Eventually, the solution is to do something like the top hat, but to do it, they call it a top kill. What they do is they collect a bunch of this sort of debris, junk material, and then they cap over the wellhead with all this junk. So they don't kick up a bunch of sand with nuclear weapons, but they just get tons and tons of this junk that they sort of pile on top of the wellhead and close it out. Eventually, this is successful, and the wells are finally capped after several months. This documentary, it's a very interesting insight into how that decision process ends up happening while they're scrambling to figure out what to do about a leaking well. I'll also say that this documentary is very friendly to the BP position. There's several interviews with high-ranking officials in government, several high-ranking officials in BP, and people like Pat Campbell, who were some of the top experts working for BP on handling this situation. Right, so these are all very high-level experts. In order to get the experts and insiders in the decision-making process of this time, in order to get this kind of access, in order to get these interviews, you can't be too critical. So this documentary doesn't say anything about what happened before, in the lead up to the to the disaster. It doesn't really say anything about the consequences for the environment or for the local shrimping populations or for anything else that happens after the fact. This documentary is almost entirely focused on just what happened in the immediate aftermath of the well starting to leak and how they made the decision to finally get it clamped. The next documentary I have is also a BBC documentary. This is called In Focus. This is from the BBC In Focus program. This is called Profit, Pollution, and Deception, BP and the Oil Spill. This is a much less friendly documentary. In this documentary, they interview a lot of the people directly affected by the oil spill, the local shrimping communities, engineers who were on the rig at the time. They talk a lot about the political ramifications and some of the environmental impact issues. Lots of interesting things from this documentary that you might want to look at. One thing, this is Doug Brown. He was the chief mechanic on the Deepwater Horizon at the time of the oil spill. He was injured, but he was not. He was injured. He wasn't killed, obviously, but he was injured during the oil spill. During the explosion. And he talks in this documentary about his experience with BP afterwards. Immediately afterwards, before he had even gone home, he was asked to sign non-disclosure agreements where he was asked to say that he didn't see anything, he wasn't aware of any violations or anything, or he was a complete non-disclosure. BP was not responsive in getting him healthcare and getting him the treatment that he needed as a result of the injuries that he faced. It's a pretty surprising story. They basically throw him under the bus. So you can hear about his experience working for BP as an engineer during this disaster. BP is not... Most of what this documentary shows is that BP is mostly concerned about their image to the public, and they're much less concerned about the impact that they have even to their own employees. In addition to interviewing Doug Brown, the documentary also interviews Oliver Hook, who's actually one of... they interview some of the wildlife experts in the area about the environmental impact of the oil spill. They show some of the cleanup efforts. They talk about how effective these cleanup efforts were. This is Oliver Hook. Oliver Hook is an environmental lawyer, and he actually wrote one of the other articles that we have reading. That's assigned for reading the required readings for this course, so you can actually see him speak on some of the issues in this documentary. It talks to the shrimping populations nearby, the impact that it has on their capacity to catch shrimp. One of the very big stories in this documentary, and it's one of the important issues to talk about in the context of the BP oil spill, is the use of core exit. So here's BP dumping a chemical called core exit. Core exit is a binding agent for the oil. So the idea is that the core exit makes the oil clump up and supposedly sink to the bottom of the ocean. So BP dumped... there's all these oil slicks from this big oil spill. These oil slicks you can see very clearly from space. You can see them from flying overhead. They look really bad. It's a constant reminder of the damage being caused by the oil spill. So in order to deal with this bad image, BP dumps millions of gallons of core exit onto the surface of the ocean, and also directly at the wellhead, the wellhead where it's all spilling from. So dumping lots and lots of core exit to try to bind together the oil so that it clumps and then falls to the ocean floor where you can't see it. So making the oil clump and bind and fall to the floor, it doesn't get rid of the oil. It just falls in the ocean floor, where it'll cover over any marine life that lives on the ocean floor. It'll sort of destroy any ecosystem that requires the ocean floor, which is, the ocean floor is an important part of the carbon cycle. Life falls to the ocean floor and then gets kicked up and then sort of recycles. All of that gets stymied when a big layer of oil sits on top of the ocean floor. And So it doesn't make the oil go away. It doesn't help the oil to be digested or processed in any way. All it does is get it off the surface of the ocean. Even maybe more importantly, core exit is extremely toxic. It's poisonous to the ecosystems, including to human beings. If you eat core exit, it's extremely poisonous. It'll cause birth defects, this kind of stuff. It's more dangerous and toxic to the environment than the oil itself. What the core exit was there to do was to get the oil off the ocean surface in order so that they couldn't take these pictures where you saw a bunch of oil around. In other words, it was brand management. It was image management. It was image management that came at an even greater cost to the natural ecosystems. Some estimates say that the core exit was more damaging to the ecosystems than the oil itself. This woman is Dr. Ricky Ott. She's a marine toxicologist, and she's talking about the toxicity of the core exit and the impact that it has on the marine ecology. Not only is core exit toxic, but it's also not legally sanctioned for this kind of use. Basically, there's not enough evidence that it's effective at handling these kinds of oil spills. It still requires lots more testing by the EPA, by the regulators. That testing isn't complete, and core exit is not recommended for this kind of use. But BP wanted to use it anyway because it gets the oil off the ocean surface. So core exit is your password for this week. But BP, despite it being against regulations, BP was able to use a lot of this core exit anyway, despite protests from scientists and environmental regulators, because BP was basically in charge of the cleanup effort entirely. Right? BP caused the spill, and then you might think that if they caused the spill, you'd want to step aside and let other people handle the cleanup efforts, but that's not what happened. In fact, what happened was Obama basically turned over the keys. This is 2010, so this is Obama's in office as his first administration, his first term. And Obama decides to give BP almost full control over the cleanup efforts. So this means that BP can run a bunch of clandestine operations, spraying core exit on the ocean without much oversight. BP was also able to close down beaches and clean them up however they want without not just public awareness, public interaction, but also without any press or journalists access, so we couldn't even see what was going on or what they were doing. Yeah, oil from the spill has been found as far north as Greenland and England. It sort of went all the way through the Atlantic Ocean. So this is important for human populations around the globe. But BP had almost total control over how it handled the cleanup effort. It was very expensive for BP. They ended up spending several $1 billion in fines and cleanup effort. Yeah. So now you have a little bit of introduction to the case. I just want to briefly point you to the 4 articles, the articles that I have that I'd like you to look at this week. Some of them are very interesting. They're all giving a slightly different perspective on what's going on. I think the Ingersoll article is a good starting point article for just getting a sense of what's going on in the case, especially for those emails that show the decision-making process. This Naomi Klein article in The Guardian, and by the way, this is a perfectly fine citation. Author name, year, title, publication source. That's fine. Okay, so Naomi Klein in 2010 writes this article in The Guardian, A Hole in the World. And a lot of her focus is the impact and the frustrations of the local shrimping and fishing communities who depend on the Gulf to, for their livelihood, for their jobs. And when the Gulf is destroyed by these environmental disasters, it becomes a political issue for these local communities. So Naomi Klein interviews some of these communities. She talks to them about their frustrations with the political leadership, with the handling of the spill, and this kind of stuff. So I've said that Obama was the president at the time. Obama hands all power over to BP. And for an example of how much in BP's control Obama was, there's this really depressing anecdote from the story where, if you remember 2010, so Obama wins in 2008 against John McCain and Sarah Palin. And Sarah Palin was part of this Tea Party movement that was advocating for offshore drilling. The catchphrase was "Drill, baby, drill." So Sarah Palin was going around giving speeches, "Drill, baby, drill." The idea is this: drill here, drill now. They wanted to get us off of foreign oil so that we weren't dependent on foreign oil. And the solution to this was to loosen regulations on offshore drilling, to get us to drill. Open up the places where we can drill, make it cheaper for these companies to drill, so that way we're less dependent on foreign oil. So the Republicans were going around chanting "Drill, baby, drill," and this created political pressure that Obama gave into, as he invariably does, Naomi Klein says. So let me just read the quote. "With cosmic bad timing, just 3 weeks before the Deepwater Horizon blew up, the president announced that he would open up previously protected parts of the country to offshore drilling. The practice was not as risky as he had thought," he explained. "Oil rigs today just generally don't cause spills. They're technologically very advanced." Right, so just 3 weeks before the largest oil spill in history, Obama gives a speech where he says that these rigs don't generally cause spills, that is unlikely to cause a spill, so we don't have to worry about damage to the environment by opening up these offshore drilling operations. In fact, they're very safe, they're very environmentally friendly. And then, of course, 3 weeks later, the drilling operation causes the worst oil spill in the largest marine oil spill in history. There's also this great line where she says that Americans learn about foreign countries. There's a saying that Americans learn about foreign countries by bombing them. Right? We learn our geography by bombing places. Well, now it seems like we're learning about nature's circulatory systems by poisoning them. Where we're learning about how much of the planet's sustainability, and especially the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream that takes all of the nutrients from the Gulf Coast and deposits them up north in England and the North Atlantic. Right? This is part of nature's circulatory system. This is part of how the natural ecology operates, and we're learning about how delicate and fragile the system is by puncturing a hole in the earth and spilling a bunch of oil all over the place. So Naomi Klein is mostly thinking about the local populations and the impact on their livelihoods. This is the Oliver Hook article. Hook is an environmental lawyer, and Hook is really thinking about the legal and regulatory frameworks that gave rise to a situation where Deepwater Horizon could happen. Right? We saw that there was this decision to use less centralizers, and that's a bad decision, yes. It's a bad decision that's probably the result of lax safety standards elsewhere on the rig, right? So if there's hundreds of other things in the rig that are also, who cares, it's probably good enough, then maybe we also think that the 6 centralizers are also good enough. But it wasn't just that decision to use less centralizers. Hook outlines a long history of laxing of regulatory standards. So for one thing, BP just wasn't very concerned about safety in the first place. BP had invested. So BP's several billion. It's a huge company. They spend $39 billion on just new oil and gas exploration, just these new exploratory drilling projects. They spend $39 billion on just the exploration. They spent $39 billion in 3 years. But over that same amount of time, they spent only $20 million on research and development for accident prevention and response, right? So their concern with safety is 0.05% of the $39 billion they spent on oil exploration. $20 million sounds like a lot of money, but when your operating budget is in the tens of billions of dollars, then $20 million isn't very much at all. Or if they had spent $200 million, they would just move that decimal place by 1.5%. Right? That's still not eating a huge chunk into your operating costs, but it's 10 times as much research, much investment in accident prevention. That kind of stuff might be useful. It might prevent the deaths of people operating on the rig. But the really crucial thing that Hook talks about in this article is this idea of a worst-case scenario. So, as I said earlier, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happens and they didn't have a response planned. They actually had to call in outside experts and come up with a response. And it turns out that the response they came up with didn't work, and so they had to come up with other responses. And this all had to be done on the fly while the well was leaking. And one of the reasons for this, Hook argues, is because language requiring consideration of worst-case scenarios has been stripped out of the regulatory frameworks over the last few dozen years, last few decades. So it used to be the case several decades ago that for a company to get authorization to do some big and potentially dangerous project, like one of these deep sea drilling operations, that the company, with its proposal, needed to include a worst-case scenario plan. The worst-case scenario plan is, in case everything that could go wrong does go wrong, right? In the worst possible situation where all of the fail-safes fail, right? What do you do in the case where all the fail-safes fail? Right? What is your last line of defense? What resources do you have on call available to handle such a situation? And it used to be just standard practice that you would include some worst-case analysis. You wouldn't expect the worst case to actually happen, but you would give some discussion of what resources you can draw upon in these worst-case scenarios. Businesses don't like talking about worst-case scenarios. It requires that the business put themselves in the worst light possible, right, to focus on their weaknesses. And that's not the kind of thing that a company likes to do. So for decades, businesses lobbied to get regulators to stop demanding a worst-case analysis and instead to demand an average-case analysis. An average-case analysis, what is likely to happen? And the idea is that an average-case analysis doesn't look so bad. In an average case, you do have resources on hand for effectively dealing with the situation. And you don't have to imagine, worst case scenario could be anything. Right? A meteor strikes. What do you do in these situations? Who knows? Those are such rare events that maybe we shouldn't need to think about them too hard. But the average case is going to happen on a regular basis, so maybe those are the ones that we should be focusing our efforts on. This seems reasonable enough to think more closely about the average case than the worst case. The thing is that when you look at the average case, the possibility of oil spills seems to go away. It seems to almost vanish because a lot of oil spills are pretty small, and most of them aren't extremely devastating like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. If you just look at the average case of oil spills, it seems like you're going to get around 21,000 barrels spilled over the next 40 years. When you do the estimates based on average case, you make it look like you get very small spills, 21,000 barrels. I mean, it's a regrettable spill, but it's the kind of thing that might not have too significant of an impact on the local environment, depending on which environment you're in. Some are more sensitive than others, but 21,000 barrels is just a sort of merely regrettable spill. You'd like to avoid it if possible, but it's not the end of the world. And if that's what you can expect over the next 40 years, then that doesn't look so bad. Right? If the kinds of spills that we're going to encounter, the kinds of things that can be put under control in about a day, right, this is the kind of information that Obama was getting that made him say things like, spills just don't happen very much, they're technologically very sophisticated. Well, yeah, it looks like it's sophisticated if your safety scenarios are only considering the average case, which you're usually equipped to handle, and don't consider the worst case, which you might not be equipped to handle, but might nevertheless show up. Right. So a few weeks after Obama says that these things don't happen, the worst oil spill in history, that spills 5 million barrels, significantly more than those 21,000 barrels. And it takes, 9 months, 7 months? Let me go back. 6 months? 6 months to correct. So Hook talks about this regulatory shift from worst case scenario to average case scenario, how changing the language of the regulation, even though it might seem like a compelling argument on paper, it actually has this corrosive effect on safety standards across the industry. And this corrosive effect is really symptomatic of broader political corruption. So the regulators for the EPA or for NEPA, for environmental quality control, for the OPA, right, for all these government regulatory processes, these regulators are usually very closely associated with the industry, very cozy, to the point that they tend to be both implicated in drug or sex scandals. They tend to have lots of collusion, lots of gift giving and bribery. You see regulators being given tickets to Louisiana State University football games, or people from industry and so on. At one point, Hook says that the senator from Louisiana is sometimes called the senator from oil because the senator has such a it is so deeply in the pockets of the oil industry. The senator will do anything to give the oil industry control because that's where they get their money, right? So if the regulators themselves are being bought by the industry, in order to change the language to lighten up on the regulatory environment so that the industry can do more, in addition to political pressure from the outside that gets popular support to let these drilling operations happen, and even the president is convinced that they're safe. Right? These are the kinds of situations that will result in major calamities. Right? Calamities where no one is prepared to deal with the consequences. And the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is not the last oil spill that we've encountered. I know there's a really big natural gas leak in California last year or the year before that was comparable in terms of the quantity of gas being leaked, but it was gas, not oil. It's a different kind of challenge to get those leaks under contained. So if you're interested in the regulatory environment, if you're interested in the historical and political issues that give rise to engineering disaster like this, check out this Hook article. I also have a Smith article. This is more focused on the environmental and economic impact of the oil spill. It was estimated in this article that around $36 or $37 billion of total damages are the result of the spill, and that BP is the primary responsible party that should be held accountable for this spill. And in fact, BP does pay billions and billions of dollars. Billions of dollars to the cleanup effort, billions of dollars to the people impacted by the spill. So if you're interested in some more detailed analysis of the environmental and economic impact, I'll note that this article, and in fact all the articles that I've mentioned so far, were written in 2010. 2010 was the year that the spill happened, so this is sort of very close. This is analysis that happened very close in time to the spill itself. With distance, maybe becomes more objectivity and sort of more perspective. So you might want to do some independent research on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill to see if these assessments have changed. Did BP actually pay out this much, or did they pay out more? Did they pay out less? Were the environmental consequences overstated, understated? How how is BP doing now? You might want to do some research to figure those things out. One last thing I want to talk about, and this is just to relate to the ongoing conversation about integrity and ethics. I have this article from Konopka on what he calls ecological goods. Using the case of Deepwater Horizon, Konopka says that it's often the case that we look at the economic impact in terms of dollar values, and really in terms of like how many organisms, how many seals died, how many dolphins died, how many fish died, this kind of stuff, trying to quantify the extent of the damage. And what Konopka argues is that the quantifying explicitly all the parts that are damaged leaves out an important feature of the case, which is the ecological integrity or the biological integrity or ecological integrity of that ecosystem. So in the Clean Water Act, biological integrity is defined as the capability of supporting and maintaining a balanced, integrated, adaptive community of organisms having a species composition, diversity, and functional organization comparable to that of a natural habitat of the region. Right, so biological integrity is where all of the parts of an ecosystem fit together in a way that is functionally comparable to the natural habitat. And so when we're doing these kinds of big operations, we want to make sure that we're maintaining biological integrity, we're maintaining ecological integrity, which is making sure that all the parts function together. So in this light, it's not just about how much, how many fish died. It's also not just about the size of the oil field. It's really about how the impact to that ecosystem affects all its parts and affects the capacity of those parts to work together properly. Right? If you cover over the seafloor, maybe that removes one important part of the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle or something. And taking out that bit of the cycle causes the whole system to collapse. And this is something that you don't quite see if you're just looking at the individual parts. You have to look at how the whole system hangs together. Right? So this is an issue of integrity, biological integrity, what Konopka calls an ecological good. The degree of benefit to the structure and functional integrity of the ecosystem is the degree of its ecological value. Therefore, an ecological good to a particular community, population, species, or organism is that arises as a result of the structural and functional integrity of the ecosystem. Right, so this is both supposed to fit in with our conversation last time about integrity as a virtue. This is also supposed to help us anticipate in the future. Next week in Lesson 9, we're going to be talking about climate change and geoengineering. And I also think that ecological integrity is going to be one of these important considerations for deciding whether to engage in some geoengineering project. I also think biological integrity, ecological integrity will be important for thinking about artificial intelligence later on in the semester when we're thinking about how technologies, artificially intelligent technologies, might impact our lives. It's not just about what those technologies do, but it's really about how it impacts the overall ecosystem, the technological ecosystem, how its impact on integrity. So if you're interested in those kinds of issues, look at this Konopka article. I think it's pretty good. I think that's it. This lecture is hopefully a little bit shorter than the rest, so that gives you some time to go over all the materials I have. It's a really interesting case. It's a very recent case. I know some students talk about this case in their other classes, so you might know things about the case that I don't know. Please share what you know. Do some research, look around, and learn some things, and share it with the class. Thank you very much. I will see you next week.